Um, just to begin, an early band of yours was the Band of Angels. Can you tell us a little bit about that band, and did you have high hopes for it in the early days?
Yeah, well, that's a good question because that's really how it all started for me, the Band of Angels. Strictly speaking, we were called a Band of Angels, and it all came from an idea, from a Christmas card. Our drummer in the early days was a guy called Jamie Rugg Price, and we were all at Harrow School together, and we'd formed this little band. I did a bit of singing, a bit of keyboard playing, and there was a guitarist called Johnny Baker, another guitarist called Johnny Gaydon, and a drummer, Jamie Rugg Price, and the bass player, David Wilkinson. And he got this Christmas card that said a Band of Angels, and you could see these little angels sort of playing flutes and harps up on a cloud. So we thought, well, that's a good name. So everyone referred to us as the Band of Angels, but we were, in fact, a Band of Angels. And we started, I think, in 1962. Or no, it might have been even 1960, because I think when we first started, we were playing Duane Eddy hits like 40 Miles of Bad, Bad Road, Peter Gunn. We were doing a few Shadows hits, like Apache, like everyone did. And I remember I sang the very first vocal in our school speech room, which was a Cliff Richard song called The Young Ones. And that probably was a little bit later. That would have been 62, I think. And so when we left Harrow School in 1962, we'd already been together a couple of years in an amateur capacity. I went up to Cambridge with Johnny Baker. Wilkinson and Rugg Price went into, Gaydon and Rugg Price went into Lloyd's, and then Wilkinson went into trainee management in Harlow. And so we managed to get together for the odd gig, even though we were all scattered by this time. And then out of the blue came this offer to turn professional, and I think by this time it was probably early 64. And I'd already come down from Cambridge and was working in a music shop called Boozy and Hawks, where they sold flutes and brass band instruments. And John Barry became our record producer, and a guy called John Coast became our manager. Now, he managed Nina and Frederick, who were pretty well known at the time. And John Barry got us our first record deal and produced it. And I suppose 64, 65, we carried on making a few records on different record labels, but the turning point for me came in 1966 when I'd written most of the material for the Band of Angels, but this last song we did was called Invitation, or strictly speaking, Accept My Invitation. And because I'd written it, they all thought I should sing it. Because I wasn't, in fact, the lead singer in the group. I was more the backing vocalist. I was good on rock and roll and soul stuff, but Johnny Gaydon was more the sort of Scott Walker of the group. He sang more with a big baritone sort of ballad-type voice. But this song suited my voice, and I think I gave Johnny Gaydon the middle eight to sing, so it was about 80 to 90% Mike Darbo featured. And luckily, this was the major turning point. We decided to do a television show, which gave us a chance to get some exposure, but it was all about public schools, and we felt, being at private school, you know, we were rather labelled as Hooray Henrys. And so we didn't want that sort of label. We thought very hard, should we do this television program and have to wear our straw boaters all over again and all the sort of the school gear, which was an image we were trying to get away from. But luckily we did agree to do it because on the same bill was Manfred Mann. And of course I didn't know it, but those in the band knew that Paul Jones wanted to leave. And so they were, unbeknownst to me, they were on the lookout for replacements. And they saw me singing this song, Invitation, and obviously made a mental note of it, because I remember Manfred sidling up to me after we'd done our little spot and saying, "Oh yeah, that's quite a good record." And I said, "Oh yeah, it's going to be a hit." And he said, "No, I don't think it's going to be a hit. It hasn't got a strong enough hook," which rather upset me. But he said, "I think you're quite good, and I'll take a phone number if I may." Now I couldn't think what he'd want my phone number for, but he said, "We may be able to get you some work. We're thinking of starting an agency," which I think was a bit of a line, because obviously he had in mind just contacting me. So I gave him a phone number and was quite surprised when I got a phone call from him a day or two later, and that actually signaled the end of the Band of Angels. We'd made, I think, 5 or 6 records, and this last one on the Pie label, or I think it was the Piccadilly label, actually changed my life completely, because was it not for that television show, I probably would have ended up, not making it, because I needed it, as we all know in this business, it's a very competitive business. Yeah. That lucky break when they chose me as the replacement to Paul suddenly, launched my career, and it hasn't treated me too badly ever since.
Absolutely. Did you feel a weight of pressure upon you taking over from Paul Jones, like big shoes to fill, so to speak?
Absolutely, John. I mean, I was sort of pretty overwhelmed. When I got the phone call from Manfred, he sort of played his cards very close to his chest. He said, "Look, I'd like to get together for lunch. Would you like to come to lunch?" Well, when I got to this lunch, I actually had a girlfriend who became my first wife, and I remember she was modeling with a fellow model of her friend of hers called Joanna Lumley, and we sort of used to phone each other at the end of the day, and she'd say, "How was your day?" And I said, "Well, I've had a call from Manfred Mann. He wants me to have lunch next week. I can't think why he does. I wonder what that's about." And she, quick as a flash, said, "I think he wants you to join the band." So by the time this lunch came, this thought had sort of planted a small seed in my mind. So I met Manfred and his wife, Tom McGuinness and his wife, and Mike Hugg and his wife, the 3 of them, the 3 surviving members. And I thought, well, they're taking a hell of a long time to get around to discussing this, because, during the lunch we sort of talked about various things, and I think I made them laugh a bit. I think I stood out a bit to them as a bit of a hooray Henry, as I mentioned earlier, but I think eventually they got to the point. Manfred said, "Look, you're sworn to secrecy, but we may be interested in you replacing Paul Jones." So I kind of thought to myself, so my wife-to-be was right after all. And one thing led to another, a few auditions, bit of testing, in front of the cameras. And really, I was completely ill-equipped, I think, to deal with filling Paul Jones's shoes, because I had hidden behind this keyboard for so long. I felt more secure singing when I had a keyboard in front of me, and I knew that I couldn't have that. So to actually stand up, even though I wanted to do it, I'd seen Tommy Steele, and I'd seen Cliff, and I'd seen Elvis, and the Everly Brothers, and Buddy Holly. These were all my heroes, and I'd seen them sort of stand up. But actually, when you're young, you need a lot of nerve to sort of have the courage to do what should come naturally. Well, I suppose I sort of grew into the part, but having seen Paul Jones and the Manfreds at a couple of gigs, I thought, oh God, I'm never going to be able to carry it off with the confidence. He had a very, well, I can say it now, I can say he has a big ego. He always came over very, not full of himself, but sure of himself in everything he did. And I knew that I was a more self-conscious, sensitive type. So that was the hardest obstacle for me, was to look as if I knew what I was doing, because I was really shooting in the dark a bit, and I didn't like necessarily the material that I was given to sing, because, you know, being the new boy and having got the job, which I did, I didn't really have much say in the material, because my job was to keep the hits coming. Now, the first song we did, funnily enough, was we recorded several songs before the news broke, one of which was Just Like a Woman, a Bob Dylan song, which we abbreviated from the Dylan version. We sort of took out verses, took out completely the middle section, and the time that it was released, it was competing with the Jonathan King version of the same record. Well, ours went top 10, and we got every plug we possibly could, television, and everyone was sort of examining this new boy, and I probably felt the weight of pressure, because I knew that people were saying, oh, he's not as good as Paul Jones, oh no. And in fact, this was proven by the fact that EMI, the record label that had got Manfred Mann as the group, they dropped Manfred Mann as the group and just kept on Paul Jones as a solo act. So that shows the degree of confidence they had in the new lineup. Well, I'm glad to say we got ourselves the record label with Fontana, which was a subdivision of Philips Records, Mercury Records, and we did make a hit, and followed it up with Semi-Detached, Suburban, and Said the Clown, and then the hits kept coming. But I knew I was a good rock and roll singer. I didn't necessarily feel I was a really good pop singer. And of course, Paul Jones had proven himself as more of a blues R&B singer. Well, I liked blues and R&B, but I think I was destined to be a pop singer because of the material that was chosen. And this was mainly Manfred. So even though I was writing songs, you know, nobody seemed to take my songs very seriously. But after a few months, and, you know, once Just Like a Woman was a hit, I thought, yeah, I can do this. And I suppose what happened is that the Paul Jones image or the R&B image that the group had changed, probably appropriate, because the times were changing too, and we were entering, you know, the psychedelic pop era of 66, 67, and so we became a different sounding group, and I probably was the right guy to be the singer for that sort of different sound, and I grew into the part, felt more confident, and then I really felt that I started to enjoy myself. Obviously the fame aspect didn't necessarily make a great fortune. I was on a wage of £50 a week, and, you know, my brief was keep making hit records for us so that we can continue to pay our mortgage. So I kind of felt like imprisoned a bit in this role that I'd made for myself, that was sort of I was cast in this mold as what I would call a pop pixie who would prance about. But it wasn't really me, but it was the part that I played, shall we say.
Were your songwriting abilities taken into account when you were recruited to the band, or did that come into factor later on?
Well, you see, if you go back to the beginning of the band, you know, before I joined, it was the Manhug Blues Brothers, and even before then, it was the Manhug Jazz Quartet. That's when Mike Hug and Manfred met at Buckland's, I think, in 1962. They were complete jazz fiends. You know, I don't think they really understood pop music or had an affinity for it. They were more into jazz. Now, they couldn't get any work as jazz musicians, so the next best thing is to move into the blues arena, which is much more, was there, 62, 63. You've got the Yardbirds and the Stones and the Animals all starting off. The Crawdaddy Club in Richmond, you've got the Marquee, and it was definitely an R&B sort of era. And I think that that's probably when the group was at its best. They got signed. Actually, what happened was the Manhug Blues Brothers couldn't get any work because they didn't have a singer. They were sort of trying this blues material, Ray Charles material, but without a singer, and they were told, look, you need a shouter, you need a front man. And so they auditioned Paul Jones, and he got the job. They didn't actually really rate him, which shows how much in touch they were with the music scene. But they said, oh, well, you'll do until someone better comes along. And they got signed to EMI as the Manhug Blues Brothers, and I think overnight EMI said, look, we've got to change your name. That's just not a good name. And so the record label, EMI, said, let's call the group Manfred Mann. Now, Manfred's real name was Manfred Lubowitz. He was the keyboard player. Mike Hugg, who's also a keyboard player, had become the drummer. But around about this time, when they recorded I think they made 2 records. Cock-a-Hoop was one, and Why Should We Not? Paul Jones had written Cock-a-Hoop, and I think they'd all given themselves credits for Why Should We Not, which was I thought a rather dirge-like instrumental, actually. When they got commissioned to write the Ready, Steady, Go theme tune, the way Paul Jones explained it to me, he said, well, I wrote the words and the music, and Mike Hugg and Manfred did the rest, which actually rather implies, between the lines, that Paul Jones wrote it himself, but because he'd only just joined the group, Manfred and Mike Hugg ran and thought it was their group, so they obviously awarded themselves credit. So if you look at the label 54321, it says Manhug Jones, but in fact it was a Paul Jones composition. So he'd already written Cock-a-Hoop, and then the follow-up to that was a thing called the Hubble Bubble Toil and Trouble, which actually credited everyone. By this time McGuinness had joined the band, and there was Mike Vickers in there. And so it goes, I think the credits go Manhug, Jones, Vickers, McGuinness. It actually got to number 11 in the charts, whereas 54321 had got to number 5. So the feeling was, oh, these group-written songs aren't doing so well. And from that moment on, every subsequent single was written by an outsider. Mm-hmm. Do What Diddy was obviously, Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, which Paul had heard. Now, funny enough, to show you the role that Paul played, apart from being the lead singer and harmonica player, he had this great record collection, because Manfred and Mike Hugg were, as I keep pointing out, jazz musicians who didn't really understand this sort of new pop rock arena that was emerging. So Paul would bring in his records, and in fact, Come Tomorrow, Sha-La-La, Do What Diddy, were all variations of records that Paul had already got in his collection. So he was a massive contributor to the sound of the band, and was also writing his own songs, some of which would appear on album tracks. But, Manfred and Mike Hugg, thinking that it was their jazz or blues group, I think felt a slight rivalry with Paul, and Paul then was told to sing Bob Dylan songs. He hated Bob Dylan. He didn't like If You Gotta Go, which I thought was a great record, and I do it myself, I love If You Gotta Go, one of the great pop records of the 60s. Paul just was not a Dylan fan, and was, by this time, when John Burgess, the record producer, said, look, I've got a new song for you guys called Pretty Flamingo, and Paul apparently said, and he owns up to this, he owns up to saying, John, if you think that's a hit song, you need your head examining. I think you've lost the plot, man. That is the most terrible song I've ever heard. Well, of course, it went to number 1, and Paul has subsequently relented and said that was a very bad judgment call on my part. But by the time I joined, the reason Paul wanted to leave was he didn't like being told what song to sing. You know, Paul had produced these records like Do Our Diddy, which had been originally a hit for a girl group, and Shalala, he'd completely changed the feel. So Paul felt he had his finger on the pulse of the musical policy of the group, and he was losing that because Manfred was taking over and saying, you know, we've got to record this song, and John Burgess was telling him what to do. So when I joined in '66, even though I saw myself as a songwriter and still do, I realized that rather like the Searchers, who also never wrote any of their own material, one felt that the group had got established through other people's songs, and that was the official music policy. Maybe a member of the group could write a B-side or maybe an album track. So I wrote songs that I thought would be good could make hit records for Manfred Mann, but even though they tried them, I never quite felt they did justice to the songs that I was writing. And one of the things that used to infuriate me about the group was mainly that whenever I played them a song, they'd say to me, how do you hear this being done? And I'd never had anyone say that to me before. Musicians I'd been around would say, oh, well, let's try it. And the sort of sound and arrangement would evolve and emerge. Now, in the case of Manfred Mann, I remember Manfred and Tom McGuinness would say, so what treatment do you hear? And I thought, what a stupid analytical, well, just play the bloody thing and let's figure out let it evolve. So I remember writing a song called Box Office Draw, and I thought, no, they're not getting it. They're not understanding what's in my head. And we did a song called Trouble and Tea, which I had heard as much more of a rock, sort of a rockier version, and it became slightly music by numbers. It sort of seemed to me slightly soulless the way they set about arranging and recording songs. So in a way, probably the best sounds we ended up making were outside songs which needed to be given a particular treatment. But in the case of my songs I'd written, I was always somewhat disappointed at the end product. I never felt I quite ended up here. The end product was never quite what I'd visualized. And that was certainly true. You know, if you go further down the line to Handbags and Glad Rags, I wrote that, played it to the group, and they said, oh, how do you hear this being done? What treatment do you hear? And I thought, just play the bloody thing. Let's do it. And Manfred, of course, couldn't, even though he was a brilliant jazz pianist, could not play my Floyd Kramer riffs, which went like this. Hang on. I'll just do this a bit louder. Well, that was basically country licks.
Yeah.
Floyd Kramer style. Manfred didn't understand that, could he? He said, what's your thing? So that was soon abandoned because they just couldn't get to grips with what I'd written. And Build Me Up Buttercup, I played them, and I said, oh, well, how do you hear this being done and all this sort of nonsense? So my songwriting successes came outside the band, and obviously in talking to you, you will have picked up a certain amount of frustration, which is in my voice and still I feel today, that even though it was a great leg up for me, gave me a sort of career, certainly gave me a shop window because people would listen to me because I, by this time, had become quote-unquote famous. So I could walk into publishers' offices and sit down at the piano and say, here's a new song, and people say, oh, great. Oh, right, well, let's do that. Let's do that with, oh, we must play that to so-and-so. I didn't get that feeling with the Manfreds, and I never had that close relationship musically with any of them, except, I suppose, for Klaus. Now, when I joined the band in '66, Jack Bruce had for the last year been the bass player of the band, and he, I remember this, picking him up for a rehearsal, actually, and he said, who are you? And I said, well, I'm the new singer. taken over from Paul Jones. And he almost, I felt, slightly looked down on me. And by the end of this car journey, he'd said, all right, well, I'm going off to form a band with my buddies Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker. And it's like he had this idea, but once he knew that I was the new singer, he thought, well, that's a great signal for me to get out too. So out he came, and I remember going down to Manfred's house, because Manfred would ring me up and say, you know, we're meeting at so-and-so, and he was my sort of contact man for the band. And he was, in a way, the leader, obviously, or had become the leader. So I went into the house, and I saw this extremely good-looking, very cool-looking guy, and I thought, oh my gosh, I know what this meeting's about. This is to tell me that I haven't got the job after all, but they've decided they've got a better singer, certainly a better-looking singer, this cool guy. And I was introduced to him, and he was Klaus Foreman, and he said to me, this is our new bass player. And I felt this huge sense of relief that I hadn't just lost the job the moment I thought I'd got the job, you know, oh, they've had second thoughts about me. And Klaus and I became great buddies because we were both the new boys, and it was basically Mike, Hug, and Manfred and Tom were the three old survivors, and I was the new boy, and Klaus was like more of a soulmate to me. And the other great bonus of having Klaus in the band was that he knew the Beatles very well from the Hamburg days. So Klaus would sometimes bring along acetates of new Beatles releases. I remember him playing us Yesterday and, you know, Yellow Submarine, all sorts of little things which the rest of the record-buying public had never heard. And he would play us things and say, oh, George is going to do this, and John's planning this. And, of course, Klaus, we now all associate with doing that Revolver cover so beautifully. So he was a great artist. He was a great musician as well. And to this day, I see Klaus and keep in touch with him. And so between us, you know, we churned out the hits. But by 1969, I did definitely feel frustrated myself. But I could also sense a frustration within Mike and Manfred because they had started their jazz group back in 62, and here we were in 69, a long, long way away from what their original musical goals had been. And I remember Mike and Manfred sidling up to me in a little Dutch television studio when we were promoting Ragamuffin Man, which was our last record, and the sort of gist of the conversation was, how would you feel about calling it a day? Because we want to get back to our jazz roots. I said, great. You know, I was pretty, felt we were not, it wasn't, what we were doing was quite far removed from what any of us really wanted to do. I wanted to be more able to perform my songs and my music, and Mike and Manfred wanted to get back to the jazz roots. So they said, great, because if us three now agree to disband the group, we've now formed a majority, because it was a group of 5. Well, Klaus didn't mind at all. I think Tom McGuinness was a bit up in arms because he suddenly felt he'd lost his regular income. In fact, I can reveal that Tom McGuinness sent me a letter, well, not him, his solicitor sent me a letter demanding £2,000 off me as compensation for stopping his income in 1969. Tom has no recollection of this, but I certainly do. And of course I couldn't pay it. I said, look, I haven't got any money. You know, I wasn't getting rich overnight by getting my weekly wage, which had now gone up in the third year to £100 a week, and that's all I ever saw. So I was certainly not had no money in the bank, and we were just spending, you know, on the rent and everything what we earned. But it was a very interesting point because Manfred and Mike had formed this band called Emanon, which was no name backwards, and that became ultimately Manfred Mann Chapter 3, which which by their own admission was an overreaction back to jazz, very avant-garde, and didn't sell a light around the world, record-wise. I don't think anybody ever remembers Manfred Mann, Chapter 3. What they do remember is the later stage when Manfred and Mike Hug went their own separate ways. By 72, and Manfred formed a band called Manfred Mann's Earth Band. But by that time, we had all split and scattered, and I remember 1969 when I had been in Gulliver's Travels at the Mermaid Theatre as an actor, and I'd started making a solo album with Andrew Oldham producing me, and I'd recorded 2 or 3 tracks, and I had Manfred's solicitors coming into the Mermaid Theatre in between my matinee performance and evening performance and issuing me with a writ. Because I had apparently broken the terms of the contract, because I was seeking to put out a solo single of See the Little People, which was my little song from the Gulliver's Travels show, and I was told I was in breach of my contract. So by the end, there was a really sour feeling within the band. It wasn't really a brotherhood, but I don't think it ever had been. It was a meeting of convenience, and I look back on that. So we made 8 records, 7 of which were big hits, and one of which Sank Without a Trace, which was a Randy Newman song called So Long Dad. And I think they were quite good records of their genre, but they certainly didn't really represent what I felt I could do. John, I've talked for far too long on that. Sam, you threw another question at me.
Yeah, look, the 2 most well-known songs in your catalogue are Handbags and Glad Rags and Build Me Up Buttercup. Both songs have pretty much had a life of their own through the years, through their covers or use in movies and television. Do you feel as attached to those songs as you may have been otherwise? They feel like a runaway child at times.
Well, I think you do feel a frustration when you know you've written as many songs as I have. You feel a frustration of why couldn't I get, and I still feel this, I'm certainly writing today, and every day I'm writing, or every day that I find the time to write and hopefully finish a song, I think this really deserves to be better known or well known. But of course today it is such a different market, and I look back, what was it that made those songs stand out? Well, there's one thing, coincidentally, they both rhyme. You've got Handbags and Glad Rags, and I remember, if I think back to what brought that song about, though I don't think I was aware of it at the time, I think it was a Jimi Hendrix record called And the Wind Cried Mary, where if you listen to that record, halfway through there's a lovely guitar solo which does sort of sound a bit like those notes I was playing earlier, like and those sort of country licks that I find play very naturally, and I think I learnt them indirectly, apart from the country pianist Floyd Kramer. But I did hear this Jimi Hendrix solo in the middle of Wind Cried Mary. So then I had the chord sequence, which was basically like this. And then there's what becomes of you, my love? If finally stripped you off, handbags and glad rags that your granddad had to sweat so you could buy. Now I remember writing Handbags and Glad Rags and thinking, those 2 words rhyme, that's nice. And I looked into the sort of depths of my mind. I never had rhyming dictionaries or anything like that. And I thought, Handbags, Glad Rags, granddads, okay. How can I string that word, make that word connect into it? And before I knew it, I was writing a song which I'd never lyrically attempted to write. People say, oh, did you have what inspired the song? Was it some incident? Do you have a grandchild? Well, of course, I was 22 at the time when I wrote it, so there was no particular thing that I was trying, no particular storyline I was trying to pursue, but I do think from time to time you get the God force working through you, what they call the muse. And the muse is really inspiration, creative inspiration, which can come from divine inspiration. In fact, the God force coming through you. I've heard of people who paint that way. I think there was a guy called Matthew Manning years ago who sort of found himself just painting things that were coming through him. He was the medium for this inspiration without saying, oh, I want to paint a specific thing. He suddenly found himself painting it. Well, in the same way, I think that force, creative force, can work through you. And I remember writing, you ever seen a blind man cross the road trying to make the other side? And I thought, where's that come from? Mm-hmm. What's that about? So bit by bit, the song sort of wrote itself. And then when I thought, handbags and the glad rags and granddads, now can I get away with saying granddads? Yes, I think I can. In other words, what I found I was writing was a girl who's probably 14 years old but looks more like 21, who believes that through all her accessories, as long as she's wearing the right clothes and handbags, and rather like today, a young guy might think if I'm wearing the right Rolex watch and driving the right sports car, I've arrived. I'm the biz. And what the song, I think, was saying is, look, there's a lot more to life than that. You've got to have some proper values to sustain you through life. You know, these are only very shallow material. It's basically a song about materialism. You know, don't think that material goods are the answer. They're not. You have to have an inner faith or set of values to sustain you through all the ups and downs that life throws at you. Now, I didn't set out to write that, but it sort of came about, and maybe when I would sing it to people, maybe I couldn't communicate it in a way that, you know, that certainly the Manfred said, oh, that's interesting, but I don't think that's for us, you know. I just saw this morning, because I'm calling from England and you're out there in Australia, Benny King was on breakfast telly this morning, and he said he wrote Stand By Me for the Drifters and recorded it with the Drifters, and the manager said, thanks, Benny, but we've already got enough material for this album. We don't need any more material. Nice song, though. And so he went off and recorded it himself. So, you know, you do get people who reject stuff, and it's happened down through the ages, and it'll go on happening. So when I was actually contacted by Andrew Oldham, he knew of my frustration within the Manfreds, which I've already explained to a certain extent. Yeah. He said, look, would you like to be part of our setup here at Immediate? You could write songs, you could produce, and the first artist he gave me was Chris Farlow, and so I played a number of songs to Chris Farlow, and immediately I played Handbags and Glad Rags. Chris jumped on it, and that was the first record we made. Not everyone is familiar with the Farlow version, but it did get to, I think, number 30 in the charts. But the difference is when I played it to Rod Stewart a couple of weeks later, nobody had heard of Rod Stewart. This is 2 to 3 years prior to Maggie May. I'm just at the piano again. I've got my foot pedal connected up. I'll play you what Rod asked me to come up with. He said, would you disguise your piano riff a little so that it features more of a woodwind sound? I really hear it being done with woodwinds. Well, this is what I came up with. Instead of this, instead of that, I came up as a... That's set against this. In fact, I'll sing it in. the problem with Rod was that he wanted to make it his first single, and I said, look, I'm just recording it with Philo, you'll have to wait a while. So I did another song with Rod called Little Misunderstood, which I was quite proud of as a song. I don't think it was very well produced or recorded, and Rod was moderately happy with it, but he couldn't wait to get his hands on Handbags. And a year later, after we'd done this Little Misunderstood, he suddenly appeared at the house one morning, said, great news, I've got the album deal, now can I do that song? Because my deal with Rod was just the singles, and I said, look, you could do the song later in your career when you've got an album deal. So he got me up, I think he came around later in the evening, actually. He must have come around 6 o'clock in the evening, and he said, I've booked a studio tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. I want you on piano. I've got Ronnie Wood on bass. I've got Ian McClagg. And it was actually what became the Faces.
Faces, yeah.
And the year was 69. And he said, but come up with this woodwind. So I had to, of course, I can't write music. I can play music. I can arrange, but I can't write the notes. So I stayed up most of the night trying to find a copyist who would write these, put these notes into musical format. And I booked a string quartet, some woodwinds, including a cor anglais, which I think is very similar to an oboe, and that was the guy who played this sound, you know. And I wasn't producing the record in those days. There was a guy called Lou Adler. And so we all showed up, and we did it in one take. Now, when I say we did it in one take, I was not happy with it, but I was on the piano, and Rod was singing, moving up and down the studio. But the sound I thought was a bit rough and ready. However, the producer said, that's good enough for me. On to the next track. And I said, hang on, Lou. I said, Rod sang the wrong lyrics there. The drum sound isn't quite right yet. And, I said, we can definitely do better. No, next track. And so I never got beyond take one with Rod, and that was put out on his first album called An Old Raincoat Never Lets You Down, released in 1969. Sold about 700 copies around the world, and he was at this point the lead singer with Jeff Beck. So certainly that was not going to change my life. But what happened was, come 1971, or was it 72, when Maggie May went absolutely ballistic all around the world, suddenly people started examining Rod Stewart's earlier recordings, and Handbags and Glad Rags became a sort of classic. And then he started including it on his live concerts. And then in 1991, when he did his Unplugged album, he re-recorded it for that. And, I don't think he does too many shows now without including Handbags. But I suppose the real turning point came then in 1999 when Kelly Jones of the Stereophonics, I think he was in New York, I think, because I'd met Kelly Jones, and he told me that he had a day off from a Stereophonics tour. He went into a record shop, bought a Rod Stewart album, and that Handbags and Glad Rags was on track one, because it's been re-released on several compilations. And he never got beyond track one. He just played it again and again and again, and decided that he wanted to record this song. And the Stereophonics were about to disband not completely, but as a sabbatical. One wanted to go off and get married, and another wanted to break. So Kelly Jones did a number of solo dates, and one of them happened to be the Hootenanny show of Jules Holland, which is the New Year's Eve show. And I think this was either New Year's Eve 1999 or maybe 2000. And somebody rang me and said, you've just had your song. Now, because nobody was listening to Handbags and Glad Rags then. It was a sort of an old Rod Stewart classic that got occasional plays here and there. They said, this guy Kelly Jones has just done it. Well, anyway, the next thing that happened is that Ricky Gervais had come up with a new comedy television idea called The Office, and my ex-wife rang me one day and said, they're using your song as the theme tune for The Office, which again was a source of great frustration because I thought it was remarkably badly played, and nobody consulted me, and I could have played it better and, you know, given them a tune at least, which didn't seem to have the tune. Anyway, that's another story. And I rang up the BBC and got through to the producer, and I said, I gather you're using my song. And he said, what song is that? And I said, it's Handbags and Glad Rags. Oh, no, that's not your song, that's a Rod Stewart song. And I said, well, actually, I wrote it. I said, what version are you using? And they said, well, we wanted to use Rod Stewart's, but his record company was charging an arm and a leg, so we have done our own generic version with our own music director, Big George. I then, a little sort of light bulb went on in my mind. I'm thinking, well, if that's going to get a weekly outing as a theme tune for a television show, I'd better contact the Stereophonics. And I got through to the manager, and he said, who's calling? And I said, Mike Darbo. Yes, what's it about? I said, well, about a song I've written called Handbags and Glad Rags. To which he said exactly the same thing. No, that's not your song, that's a Rod Stewart song. And I said, yes, but I actually wrote it. And he said, well, it's extraordinary you should be ringing up. It's their next single. And I thought, my goodness. So suddenly that brought that song back into focus in the year 2000 as the Office theme, which I wasn't very happy with, and the Stereophonics recording, which was, of course, a carbon copy of the Rod Stewart version, which I had arranged and stayed up all night doing. So suddenly I felt, my goodness, maybe there is some justice in the world after all, because as you and I know, we rely on our royalties to sort of live and breathe. And for the next few years, my bank balance looked a little bit healthier. So that was the story behind that song. Now, Build Me Up Buttercup was a song that I had written and in its entirety, as I thought, and I played it to a producer friend of mine called Tony McCauley, who was looking for new songs for his acts, and his acts were David Essex, Long John Baldry, the Paper Dolls, and the Foundations. And I played him this song, Build Me Up Buttercup. Now the only difference was, well, I'll show you, I'll play you now what I played to Tony McCauley back in '68. When did I, you build me up, buttercup, baby, then you let me down. You mess me around and I'm worst of all. You never call, baby, when you say you will. But I love you still, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. I'll be over and then you tell me time and again, but you're late. So in other words, the chorus was a half chorus. Mm-hmm. And Tony McCauley heard it and said, look, I think you're not making enough of the chorus. You should extend it a bit. So between him, Tony, and myself, I took his point. He suggested, I need you more than anyone, darling. Know that I have from the start. So build me up, buttercup, but don't break my heart. So the next thing that happened was that now it was a Macaulay Darbo song, or Darbo Macaulay song, and he said, well, I'd like to record it with the Paper Dolls, and I'd like to have a piano and voice version. Could you come into Pi Studios, and I'll play tambourine. So I put down the backing track, just on piano, and then as these notes were going, I suddenly had an idea, and I said, after the intro, why do you build me up? That idea of just, why do you build me up, literally came as I was about to sing on the demo version we were making for the Paper Dolls. I said, Tony, what do you think of that? He said, yeah, I like it. Up till that point, the song had been 1, 2, 3, 4. You build me up. So the why do you build me up came at the 11th hour. And then he rang me a couple of days before the session, which I was going to play piano on. And he said, the Paper Dolls can't come down for the session. I'm thinking of trying it with the Foundations. Do you mind? I said, oh, no, good heavens, no. He'd already played it to David Essex, who turned it down on the grounds that he didn't want to sing a song dedicated to a cow, because in his view, Buttercup was always the name of a cow like Clarissa or Tinkerbell or something, you know. So he said, no, I'm not interested in that song. And in fact, Baldry did do another of my songs on another subsequent occasion. So yeah, the Foundations. And so I came in, played piano, and I suppose you could say the rest is history, because it went, something I didn't know until quite recently, went to #1 in America. But to complete the Darbo hard luck story, I can tell you that I did not get paid 1 penny from 8 million sales around the world, not 1 penny.
Oh, no.
Nor did I, hasten to add, did Macaulay, I don't think, because immediately that became a hit. Joe Beat, the publishers, the Tamla Motown publishers, claimed it was infringing a song that was a B-side for the Four Tops called Turn to Stone. And even though I can't sing you the Turn to Stone song, because I don't really know it, the bit that I can't agree with was turn to stone, every time I need my turn to stone, turn to stone. Well, those two words, da-da-da, or those three words, three notes, build me up, turn to stone. I mean, okay, so what? Well, as a result of that, millions of pounds of royalties were held in escrow for about 20 years in some agency in New York called the Harry Fox Agency, from which they got very rich on all the interest. All the lawyers got very rich fighting the case and discussing it amongst themselves. I was so broke I couldn't even get out to America to sort of try and be at the court case. And my lawyer representing me said, oh, no, I'm sorry, they've won the case. You'll be able to get paid in 10 years' time, but all royalties up till then go to Joe Beat. So I felt very hard done by, but by the time 1998 came along, when we suddenly got a phone call to say that the song was being featured in a film called There's Something About Mary, we got quite excited, especially it was quite a hit movie, even though I have to say to you, John, that the soundtrack is pretty appalling. You know, sometimes soundtracks from movies sell really well. There was this guy called, I'm trying to think of his name, I can't think of him.
Jonathan Richman.
I can hear. Jonathan Richman, that's it.
Yeah.
Come to me. Jonathan Richman, in my opinion, this is a purely personal view, being featured in the film singing 3 or 4 songs, absolutely appalling songs, pretty bad songwriter in my view, but there he was featured in the film. So Jonathan Richman songs, There's Something About Mary and all that, C-R-A-P, if I may say so, didn't really help the record sales. Apart from that, there was some really good stuff on it. There was a Shirley Bassey track, but Jonathan Richman, no, he gets a thumbs down in my book. So, in fact, we didn't do very well on the soundtrack album, but over the years, what it has done is brought people's attention to that song through that film. And for many years, I would get rung up by my younger cousins and nephews and different members of the family at about 3 in the morning. They'd say, look, Uncle Michael, look, they're playing your song at our disco. And it's still now become a classic party song, and I obviously do it with my band. I actually do it with the Manfreds too, and so I count myself very lucky. And I remember another lesson I learned off that, when the music publisher contacted me, said, look, this song, Build Me Up Buttercup, we've got to issue contracts to you and Tony Macaulay. How should we split it? And I said, I'll make it 75-25, because Tony Macaulay's only come up with a little bit of the song. And I got a call from Tony Macaulay, who had produced the record, and he said, look, that song is 50-50 split down the middle, or else that record is not coming out. So I really realized from that it's better to have 50% of something than 100% of nothing.
Absolutely.
And so I've written other songs, but of those two particular instances where I had Rod Stewart and Chris Farlow and the Foundations already sort of tailor-made for me, unless you have those situations where you've got the power, you're actually at the vanguard of where the decision-making is made for a new release. Unless you're in that position, it's very, very hard to get songs away. So I've written other songs I think should be or should have been hits, but getting them to the artist, getting them to hear them is, especially when you're not Flavor of the Month anymore, is very, very hard. And then the other thing is you can send a song to someone and they'll say, oh yes, we'll do that, and then hear that the end product and find that they've absolutely ruined, got all the chords wrong, maybe sung some of the lyrics wrong, and you think, oh, they haven't really done justice. Why didn't they involve me? So I like to be involved right the way through till the bitter end, and then I sort of feel my musical input is going to be honoured and respected.
A couple of other interesting things you were involved with. You're on the original Jesus Christ Superstar soundtrack, is that right?
Yes, well, 1969, when Manfred Mann split, I had a business manager called Lawrence Myers, and he got me signed up to MCA Records. And I did do my first album, I think it came out in 1970, it was just called Darbo. It was okay, it was sort of, Headmaster's report would say, could do better, but showed some promise, I suppose. On that same label were two unknown writers that Brian Brolly had signed. Brian Brolly was the head of the record label. And he said, Michael, I'd like you to meet two young writers I've signed. They've been turned down by 3 record labels. They've got a new project called Jesus Christ Superstar. So I met young Tim and young Andrew. And Tim and I have been great friends ever since. Well, I know Andrew very well as well. But Tim, subsequently, I've been in his cricket team, the Heartaches, and we see a lot of each other. I don't see quite so much of Andrew, but they were charming to me, and they said, look, you can have any part you want. This was before the recording had taken place. Any male part, do you want to be Judas? Do you want to be Jesus? Do you want to be... And I said, oh, gosh, sounds like lots of learning to do. No, I said, I'm very busy at the moment. Could you just give me one song? And they said, how about the King Herod song? So I went round to their place and heard Andrew play in this slightly old-fashioned sort of Mrs. Mills type of way, the score, and Tim would sort of try and sing it. And I thought, oh, well, I don't know, this is... okay, yeah, we'll have a go. But I walked into the studio, and of course by this time the Grease band had been at work putting down the backing tracks, and they were Joe Cocker's backing band, and what a band. And immediately I walked in and heard the tracks. I thought, this is a transformation from what Andrew's piano playing had been like, so maybe I hadn't seen the full potential. And when I heard these backing tracks, I thought, no, we're onto something here. But anyway, I sang the song in about 25 minutes and left and never thought anything more about it. And I remember Murray Head, who'd played the part of Jesus, and of course Yvonne Elliman was Mary Magdalene, and Ian Gillan had been Judas, or maybe, yeah, I think that's right. I think I've got it right. They put out the soundtrack, this original recording. This is long before the stage production, and nothing much happened in this country. But over in America, it became a very popular thing for colleges to do, and school productions. So it's really thanks to America, and I do believe that Paul Newman was on a first-class flight from New York to London, and he met Tim, and he said, oh, you know, my daughter is part of a wonderful school production of Jesus Christ Superstar. We think it's wonderful. So thanks to America and all these little local productions, which of course Tim and Andrew had always envisaged, but they couldn't get the backing to make it straight into a stage production. So it was fully 3 years after we'd recorded, I think it was probably 1970, I did my little King Herod song, which was only a very small part of this soundtrack album. Well, I think it was 1972 or possibly 73 when I went to see the first Broadway production. And I was amazed because the King Herod song, I just sung it and forgot about it. I'll tell you what, I'll sing you a little bit of it here right now. Jesus, I am overjoyed to meet you face to face. You've been getting quite a name all about the place. Healing cripples and raising from the dead. Now I understand you, God. At least that's what you said. So you are the Christ. You're the great Jesus Christ. Prove to me that you're no fool. Walk across my swimming pool, and so on like that. Well, when I saw this guy walk on in drag with high heels and camp up my performance, I thought, my God, this is extraordinary. Initially, I felt rather insulted because I thought, oh, they've taken this to be a sort of a drag song, a comedy song, and everyone was in hysterics. And when he does the bit, walk across my swimming pool, you could see that he was being, King Herod was being treated as a total buffoon. But all I knew was I sang the song, performed it, walked out of the studio, thought nothing more about it. But in fact, in this country, they've just recently revived it, and the Radio 1 disc jockey, Chris Moyles, has played the part of King Herod, and it brings the house down every night. So you realize that I was the sort of blueprint for something that became a bit of a showstopper, which I had no idea. And I must stress also that it is the most wonderful show, and I didn't really see at the time what Andrew and Tim were on about. And I know a lot of people who turned it down. Colin Blunston turned it down, and a guy called John Hendricks, who's possibly not a household name, but Lambert, Hendricks and Ross, he found it blasphemous. And round about 1970, whenever that thing was first released, people did think, this is blasphemous, how dare they? But really what it is doing is not glorifying, but going into great detail the last week of Jesus' life, what they call the Passion. And it's an astoundingly powerful piece of theatre, and I think will live forever. So I'm glad to have been just a small part of what's become, a theatrical masterpiece.
Sure. And speaking of theatre, you played the part of John Lennon on stage at one point. Is that right?
No, I never did. I've done a very small amount of stage work, but never on Jesus Christ Superstar. What I did do, John, apart from the Gulliver thing that I mentioned, I played Gulliver on two productions, one in 68, 69, and one in 75, 76. And these were sort of Christmas panto productions. But I did briefly play John Lennon in a theatre production, a Royal Court production of a play by Howard Barker called No One Was Saved. And it was all a false premise because Howard Barker, who was quite a famous playwright, rather assumed that John Lennon had written the song Eleanor Rigby. Well, you and I know that it was a Paul McCartney song. So in a way it defeated the object of the exercise from the outset, because Howard Barker had John Lennon writing the song and going up to Blackburn and meeting, he basically dramatized the song. And there's Father Mackenzie in there, and there's of course Eleanor Rigby, which was played by Maureen Lipman, who became a very, very famous actress. And I played the part of John Lennon, and I had to sort of get the gear, I had to get the voice right, which I never really did. I always sounded a little more like George Harrison than John Lennon. And I remember the director of the show was a woman called Pam Brighton, and she said, Mike, you're not doing that line right, love. No, you're not got that line right. And I somehow tried to be John Lennon, the rocker from Hamburg days, and then transforming into John Lennon, the sort of love is all cosmic universe, sort of stuff. It was the most awful play, I thought, because it was nothing to do with, fact at all. But anyway, I did briefly for about a month play the part of John Lennon, and then I had to do a television show, and they wouldn't let me off, so I said, okay, well, I'm leaving the show, and another actor took over my part of John Lennon. I gather did it rather better. So those were my two little outings on the stage. But, these days I see my role as still playing live music, obviously sometimes with the Manfreds, quite a lot with my band, because, I have my function band, which, for those who haven't come across it, is called Mike Darbo and his Mighty Quintet. And the Mighty Quinn, obviously, is subtle reference in there. And it means that I'm limited to 5 people on stage, which is fine. I'm the keyboard player and the singer. I have Steve DeGutis on guitar and vocals, Dick Cadbury on bass and vocals. I've got a great sax player called Simon Curry, and when he can't do it, because he's with the Manfreds as well, I bring in another guy called Chris White, and then sometimes another sax player called Frank Abrams. And then I've got a drummer called Owen Howell. And we do a lot of weddings and parties. And, 2 weeks ago we did the Royal Yacht Squadron Sailing Club in Cowes for Cowes Week, which, always has a lot of royalty present. So I've played in front of all the royal families. But I also do stuff just at the piano on my own, which is me, like, trying to be Ray Charles sometimes one moment and reliving, early memories of Bobby Darin and the Everly Brothers. And I do anything. My musical tastes are so broad and varied. I'll never forget the rock and roll era that the Beatles were brought up on, which was basically Buddy Holly, the Everlys, Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis, Chuck Berry, of course. And to hark back to that, I do remember very well the Beatles. I was probably their biggest fan. I bought everything, every Beatles monthly, every EP. I've got all their stuff still. I play it all the time. But I remember thinking that I could actually join the Beatles. It just shows you how my imagination had run amok, really, because I thought to myself, they need a fifth Beatle, they need a fifth harmony, they need a keyboard player, someone who can add yet another harmony. Well, of course, that was never going to happen because I'm not from Liverpool, and why would they want me? If they were going to add anyone to their band, they'd probably have added, a guy from, like, Jerry Marsden or Johnny Gustafson or someone like that. But the next best thing came along, because suddenly out of the blue I get the offer to join Manfred Mann. So music and my love of music, which I've never lost any enthusiasm for, has really been my life. The only thing I look back on, I think, if I hadn't been such a family man, because I'm now in my 3rd marriage and I have my little 6-year-old twins, so there's a 40-year age gap between my oldest boy, who's 46, and my twins, who are 6. So I've had 5 children, 3 marriages, and I love my domestic commitments, and I'm a cook and I'm a landscape gardener. And I think if I'd been more fully committed to follow through all my musical ideas to the at the cost of sacrificing maybe family life, maybe I would have achieved more, but then I would have been frustrated on the personal side as well. So, when you look at back what life requires of you on so many levels, I don't think it's been too bad. But I suppose on my epitaph I would write, would like to have achieved more than what the world knows him for.
Yeah.
If that doesn't sound too corny, John.
No, that covers it beautifully. Hey, Mike, I've got to thank you for your time. It's been an absolute honour to speak with you. I think we've covered the whole range of your career very nicely indeed.
We did actually. I did, as I probably said, I didn't, in my email, I didn't think there was much to talk about, but once you get me going, there's no stopping me.
And that's just the way we like it. Thanks so much, Mike. Hope we can see you back down here in Australia sometime soon.
Yeah, well, there's talk about June and July of next year.
Oh, really?
Apparently, small, but I'm not involved in the negotiating side, so I don't know with whom or what or when or why. But I've heard rumours.
Oh, well, we're here waiting for you.
And John, if that does come about, I'd love to get together.
Yep, we'll do that for sure. That'd be fantastic.
I'm sorry, I hope I haven't dominated too much. I probably have.
No, not at all. That's fantastic, Mike.
Bless you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye for now.
We'll keep in touch. Bye-bye.